first time I saw my stepfather lose his color, it was on my wedding day, with one hand frozen over a stack of papers that were supposed to make him red. The other hand was shaking so badly he dropped his pen. And right behind him, walking through the doors of the church like a ghost that had decided to come back and ruin his life, was my Uncle Henry, the man everyone in our family had believed was dead for almost 15 years. The room went silent so fast I could hear my own pulse. My bouquet slipped in my hands. My mother gasped. Someone in the back whispered, "That's not possible." But it was. Uncle Henry stood in the aisle wearing a dark suit that looked too big on his lean frame, his silver hair combed back, his face lined by time and whatever hell he had lived through. He looked older, thinner, and angrier than I remembered, but his eyes were the same, sharp, steady, alive. And when he looked at my stepfather, a man who had spent nearly 2 decades acting like he owned our family, he smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. "Mark," he said, his voice carrying through the church, calm and cold. "Still collecting things that don't belong to you?" My stepfather took one stumbling step backward. Then, without warning, he turned and ran. Not walked, not argued. Ran. He pushed past 2 chairs, nearly knocked over a flower stand, and bolted through the side door like a thief caught red-handed. That was the moment everything my family had been hiding for years started coming apart. But to understand why my stepfather ran like that, you have to understand what he had spent years building, and what my uncle had spent years protecting. My name is Claire Bennett, and until that day, I thought my life had been stolen piece by piece in ways I would never get back. I was 9 years old when my father died. At least, that was the story everyone told me. My father, Richard Bennett, had been the kind of man who made a room feel steadier just by walking into it. He owned a small chain of auto repair shops across Ohio, worked with his sleeves rolled up, and knew the names of every mechanic, customer, and kid who wandered into his office with scraped knees and a complaint about the candy machine. My Uncle Henry was his younger brother. Not the polished kind of uncle who sent birthday checks and forgot your middle name. Henry was the kind who showed up with a toolbox, a bad joke, and a whole lot of noise. He and my father were close enough to fight like brothers and laugh like boys. Then came the night of the accident. My father's truck left the road on a rainy stretch outside Columbus and went down an embankment. The police said it was slick conditions. A tragic loss. No foul play. No suspects. No reason to dig deeper. My mother, Linda, was devastated. Or at least, that's how it looked to me then. She was crying all the time, moving through the house like a shadow. And before I fully understood what was happening, a man named Mark Ellis had started showing up at our house more and more often. He was polite in that practiced way some men are polite when they want something. He brought casseroles. He fixed the back gate. He told my mother she shouldn't have to do everything alone. He was there when I needed help with my homework. He was there when the brakes on my bike failed. He was there the day my mother signed papers she said were just legal things after my father's death. Within 2 years, Mark Ellis was my stepfather. He moved into our house. He rearranged my father's den. He changed the locks on the garage. He made it sound like all of it was practical, temporary, for the family. My Uncle Henry hated him immediately. I remember one Thanksgiving, when I was 10, Henry leaned across the table and asked Mark, "How's it feel, wearing another man's shoes?" Mark laughed like it was a joke, but his fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. My mother told Henry not to start trouble. She said we needed peace. Henry looked at her for a long time and said, "Peace is what people call it when they don't want to say the word lies." 2 weeks later, he stopped coming around. At first, we thought he was angry. Then my mother said he had taken a job in Michigan. Then months passed. Then years. He missed birthdays. He missed my school dance. He missed my graduation from high school. Eventually, people started saying he had gone to Mexico. Then gambling debts. Then prison. Then a drinking problem. Every year, the story changed depending on who was telling it. By the time I was 22, my Uncle Henry was just a sad family rumor. My stepfather kept the company growing. He called it Bennett Automotive at first, then quietly changed the name to Ellis Family Motors. He said it made business sense. He said my father would have wanted efficiency. He said a lot of things, in a calm, reasonable voice that made other people trust him before they had time to question him. What he did not say was that he had slowly taken control of every asset connected to my father. The shops, the warehouse lot, the old lake house my father had inherited from his mother, even the savings accounts. Whenever I asked my mother about it, she told me not to stir up the past. "You're lucky Mark kept us afloat," she said once, while standing in the kitchen washing the same coffee mug over and over again. "Do you know what it was like after your father died? Bills everywhere, men calling, threats about debt. I did what I had to do." I believed her for a long time. Then, 3 months before my wedding, I found the first crack in the story. I had gone to the county records office to request a copy of my father's estate documents. I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted to understand what belonged to my family and what had been sold off under my feet. The woman behind the desk typed for a moment, frowned, and asked me to wait. When she returned, she carried a thick file and looked uncomfortable. "Most of this has been amended," she said. "But there's something odd." Odd was putting it lightly. The original probate papers had my father's signature on them, but they had been filed after his death, not before, and several of the property transfers had no notarization date. One document in particular looked wrong. The ink was newer than the paper. The signature line showed my father agreeing to a sweeping transfer of authority to Mark Ellis over everything, including future inheritance decisions. There was just one problem. My father's signature was slightly off. The first letter in his last name slanted the wrong way. It wasn't his hand. It was a convincing imitation, but not his. My throat went dry. I asked the clerk if there was any original will on file. She shook her head. "No," she said. "Only these court-submitted amendments." Court-submitted amendments. That phrase lodged in my chest and refused to move. I took copies home and spread them across my bedroom floor like puzzle pieces from a crime scene. That night I called the one person I thought might help me make sense of it. An old family attorney named Michael Trent, who had retired years ago and whose office was now a dental clinic. He invited me to his house the next morning. Mr. Trent was small, thin, and a little shaky in the hands, but his memory was exact. He looked at the papers for a long time, then took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "These are not the documents I prepared," he said. I stared at him. "What do you mean?" He leaned back slowly. "Your father made a very clear will the year before he died. Very clear. It left the business and property in trust for you, to be managed until you turned 30. Mark Ellis was never meant to control anything beyond what your mother already owned jointly." My voice came out small. "Then where is the real will?" He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "That's the question I've been waiting 15 years to answer." I felt the room tilt around me. Mr. Trent stood and walked to a locked cabinet in his hallway. He returned with an envelope wrapped in faded legal tape and a note pinned to it in my father's handwriting. "If anything happens to me, Henry knows what to do. Trust Henry." My hand started shaking before I even touched the envelope. Inside was a letter from my father, dated 3 weeks before the accident. He wrote that if this ever reached me, it meant something had gone wrong. He said he no longer trusted Mark. He said Mark had been asking too many questions about the shops, the land, and the insurance policies. He said Henry was helping him keep the original will safe. The letter ended with one line that made me sit down hard in my chair. "If they tell you Henry is gone, do not believe them." I read it 3 times. Then I looked up at Mr. Trent with tears burning my eyes. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice had gone quieter. "It means," he said, "that your Uncle Henry disappeared for a reason." The wedding was supposed to happen 12 weeks later. I was marrying Daniel Carter, a civil engineer from Cleveland who had the rare gift of listening before he spoke. He knew I had family baggage, and somehow he never made me feel broken for carrying it. When I told him I'd found something suspicious about my father's estate, he didn't tell me to let it go. He asked me what I needed. I said I needed the truth. So, quietly, without telling my mother or Mark, Daniel and I started digging. What we found made my blood run cold. Mark Ellis had not just benefited from a bad accident and a grieving widow. He had used forged documents, financial pressure, and what looked a lot like intimidation to take control of my father's assets. Several former employees remembered being told not to discuss anything about the night of the crash. One mechanic said Mark had shown up at the body shop the morning after the funeral before the family had even eaten breakfast and told everyone the future was changing. The old lake house had been sold under suspicious terms to a shell company owned by one of Mark's college friends. The insurance payout had been redirected. A trust fund my father had set up for me as a child had been quietly dissolved by mutual agreement signed while I was a minor. The deeper we went, the more it felt like somebody had spent years erasing my father in tiny, legal strokes. The worst part was my mother. When I asked her directly whether she had known, she went pale. "Claire, don't do this now," she said. "We are about to celebrate your wedding. Why would you want to drag up all that pain?" "Because it's my father," I said. "Because someone stole from him. Because I think Mark did it." Her eyes darted to the window. That was answer enough. "I signed what he put in front of me," she whispered. "I was scared. You don't understand what it was like after your father died." "Scared of what?" She squeezed the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. "Of being left with nothing." I stared at her, stunned. "You let him take everything." "I let him make it easier," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know the whole picture, but you knew enough." She couldn't look at me. That night, I found her sitting alone in the dark living room, crying with her face in her hands. For a moment, I wanted to hate her, but she looked so tired, so ashamed, that all the anger I felt tangled into something more painful. Fear had made her weak. Mark had made her compliant, and my father's memory had been buried under both. There was only one thing left to do. I called the probate attorney listed on one of the old records and demanded a full review of my father's estate. Then I filed a request to open a fraud investigation. Daniel helped me gather the documents. Mr. Trent agreed to testify. The county clerk who had first noticed the strange amendment also said she would speak if needed. Mark didn't know yet. That was the plan. We were going to let him reveal himself at the wedding reception when most of the family would be there, when he would be confident and distracted, when he would least expect to be exposed. The lawyer was supposed to arrive at 4 p.m. with a sealed packet containing the original will and a court motion to freeze any further transfer of assets. At 3:20, my Uncle Henry walked through the church doors. I still couldn't breathe properly even after Mark ran. Henry didn't look at me first. He looked at my mother. She made a sound like a wounded animal. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Henry," he gave a short nod. "Linda." She started crying immediately, covering her mouth with both hands. He didn't rush to hug her. He didn't rush to me either. He stood there, letting the reality of his return settle into the room before he moved another inch. Then his eyes met mine and softened. "Claire," he said, "you look just like your father did when he was nervous." I laughed and cried at the same time and nearly dropped my bouquet. I stumbled toward him, and he caught me with a strength I hadn't expected from such a thin man. He held me for a moment, and I smelled old cologne, dust, and the faint scent of rain on wool. I pulled back, staring at him. "You're alive. Last time I checked, everyone said you were dead." "Yeah," he said, glancing down the aisle where Mark had fled. That was the point. He had barely said those words when the front doors opened again. This time, it was the lawyer. A tall woman in a gray suit, carrying a leather case, came in at a fast walk. She took one look at Henry, then nodded. "Mr. Bennett," she said. My head snapped toward Henry. Henry looked at me and gave the smallest smile. "Told you I knew what to do." My knees nearly gave out. The lawyer introduced herself as Vanessa Cole and asked if we could clear the front of the church for a private review. Someone in the back started recording on their phone. My cousin kept asking what was happening. My mother had gone completely rigid. Vanessa opened her case and pulled out a sealed packet with my father's initials stamped in red wax. "I am here," she said, her voice crisp and clear, "to present the original last will and testament of Richard Bennett, executed and witnessed in accordance with Ohio law, and to file an emergency motion challenging the transfer of any property, funds, or controlling interest made under false pretenses." Nobody spoke. Then she looked around and added, "If Mark Ellis is present, He should be advised not to leave the county. At that, my mother started sobbing harder. Henry touched my shoulder and said quietly, "We should have done this years ago." "Why didn't you?" I asked, still stunned by the fact that he was standing in front of me at all. His expression changed. "Because your father told me to disappear." That sentence hit the room like a gunshot. I pulled him toward the side chapel, away from the crowd, while Vanessa remained with my mother and the few family members who had started gathering around. Henry sat down on the first pew and rubbed both hands over his face. "Start from the beginning," I said. He looked up at the stained glass window for a long time before speaking. "Your father found out Mark was stealing months before the crash," he said. "Not just money. Information. Access. Your father caught him copying account records and making calls after hours to people he didn't know. He hired a private investigator. He also changed his will." My heart was pounding. "He wanted to remove Mark completely," Henry continued. "But he was afraid if Mark knew too soon, something bad would happen to your mother or to you. So he asked me to move the original documents to a safe place and stay out of sight until the time was right." "Why would he think Mark would hurt us?" Henry let out a bitter laugh. "Because Mark had already started acting like a man who'd decided he was entitled to your father's life. And because your father found out about the accident." I went cold. What accident? The brakes on his truck had been tampered with. I couldn't process it at first. The church noise faded away. The air felt thin. "No," I whispered. Henry nodded once. "Your father suspected it wasn't random. He told me the night before he died that if anything happened to him, I had to protect the will and disappear until I had proof. I argued with him. He said Mark was the kind of man who smiled while he sharpened a knife." My stomach twisted. "He told you to disappear," I repeated. "Yes. So where were you all these years?" Henry's jaw worked back and forth, as if he hated the memory. "I spent the first 2 years in Wisconsin under a different name. Then I moved again. I worked construction. Then trucking. Then maintenance at a resort in Tennessee. I kept my head down. I watched. I listened. I waited for the right moment." "The right moment for what?" He looked at me directly. "For Mark to overreach." That answer made me stare. Henry went on. "A few months ago, he filed paperwork to force the sale of the remaining Bennett assets before your wedding. He thought your mother's signature and the older amended records would be enough. But once he started that process, it opened a new review. That review brought me out of hiding." "And the lawyer?" "Vanessa was assigned through the ethics office after I came forward with my identity. We found the original will in a sealed deposit box your father set up under an alias. We also found his notes. Everything was waiting. He planned for this. I sat down across from him, barely able to keep still." "He knew?" "Your father knew Mark would try something. He just didn't know how far Mark would go." I thought about all the years my mother had lived in that house with a man she didn't fully trust. All the years Mark had been smiling at family dinners, shaking hands, helping with casseroles, speaking softly while slowly emptying the house of its real history. And I realized something terrible. He had not just stolen property, he had stolen time. He had stolen grief itself, turning it into a business plan. The rest of that day unfolded like a storm. When Mark finally tried to return, 2 deputies were already waiting. He had left the church in such a panic that he'd driven straight to his office to gather records. But Vanessa had already placed emergency holds on the properties and accounts. The county investigator arrived before sunset. So did the state fraud unit. Mark attempted his usual performance. He claimed confusion. He claimed family tension. He claimed the original will was fabricated, and that Henry had resurfaced to settle a personal vendetta. He even tried to suggest my father had been unstable before his death. That mistake cost him. Because Mr. Trent brought in hospital records showing my father had been physically examined after a minor work injury 2 weeks before the crash, and his health was excellent. The mechanic from the shop testified that Mark had been in the maintenance garage alone the day before the accident. The county clerk produced copies of altered filings with matching handwriting from Mark's old notary contacts. Vanessa revealed bank transfers to shell accounts that had been routed through companies owned by Mark's college friend. And then Henry pulled out the last piece. It was a small weathered notebook. "My brother kept this in the glove box," he said. "He gave it to me the night before he died." The room turned so quiet it was almost painful. Henry opened the notebook to pages filled with my father's handwriting. Dates, names, call logs, suspicious transactions. A note about the brakes being checked. Another about Mark asking whether life insurance was fully protected. Another about my mother seeming frightened but saying nothing. Then, on the final page, there was a message addressed to me. Claire, if Henry gets this to you, it means I was right to trust him. Do not let them tell you this was an accident. Do not let them take your name. Whatever they did to me, they tried to do to our whole family. Fight for what's yours. And forgive your mother if you can. Fear can make people smaller than they really are. I had to stop reading because my vision blurred. My father had known. He had known. And he had tried to leave a trail for me, and all these years I had believed the wrong story because someone stronger had controlled the room. When I looked up, Mark was already handcuffed. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked powerless. That should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt like standing in the middle of a wreck and realizing how much wreckage remained. The investigation didn't end that night. Over the next several weeks, everything came out. Mark's forged transfer documents were exposed. The probate court invalidated the amendments. The property sales were reviewed one by one. The shell company purchases were challenged. Several bank accounts were frozen. The police reopened the accident case, and while enough time had passed to make a criminal conviction difficult, the tampering evidence was strong enough to file charges related to fraud, identity misuse, and conspiracy. The hardest blow was for my mother. People love to imagine betrayal as a dramatic, instant event, but the real kind takes years to unpack. My mother had not been evil. She had been weak when strength was required, afraid when courage mattered, and ashamed when truth would have helped. That does not excuse what she did, but it explains why she did it. And when everything collapsed, she finally admitted the full story. Mark had isolated her little by little. He had insisted on handling the finances to reduce stress. He had told her the business was too complicated for her to understand. He had made her believe that any fight over the estate would leave us in debt or ruin. She had signed papers she didn't fully read because she was terrified of losing the home, the car, the life she had left. And worse, she had been too afraid to tell Henry when he first warned her. I thought if I kept my head down, things would stay stable, she told me in tears one afternoon. I thought I was protecting you. You were protecting him, I said. And I regretted the cruelty in my voice the second I said it. She flinched like I'd struck her, but then she nodded. Yes, she whispered. I was. That was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. I wanted to hate her. Sometimes I did. But grief is strange. It can make room for anger and mercy in the same breath. As for Henry, his return changed more than the case. It changed our family's memory. At first, I could barely look at him without crying. He apologized over and over again for not coming back sooner. But every time he tried, I would stop him. He had followed my father's instructions. He had kept the will safe. He had survived long enough to make the truth impossible to bury. That was not failure. That was endurance. Still, one question lingered in my mind. Why didn't you call me? I asked him one evening after the worst of the hearings. We were sitting on the porch of the lake house, the first property that had been returned to the family trust. The water was dark and still below us. You could have found a way. He watched the light flicker over the lake before answering. Because if I called, Mark would know there was a line still connecting me to your father, he said. And if he knew that, he might have used you to find me. I stayed gone because your father wanted at least one of us to survive with the truth intact. That answer hurt more than I expected. He glanced at me. Your father loved you more than he feared losing the fight. I nodded slowly, wiping my face. I wish I had known him as an adult, I said. Henry smiled sadly. You do. In the way you speak. In the way you stand up when you're scared. In the way you don't back down when somebody lies to you. I wasn't sure I believed him then, but I do now. The wedding itself was postponed, of course. No one felt much like celebrating that afternoon. But Daniel refused to let the day become only about loss. 2 weeks later, after the legal motions had started moving and the biggest fear had finally passed, we held a smaller ceremony by the lake house instead of the church. There were no fancy flowers, No dramatic organ music. Just family, folding chairs, and a late summer breeze off the water. My mother came, though she looked older than she had a month before. She sat in the front row with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Henry walked me halfway down the aisle. When Daniel saw me, he smiled like the world had finally remembered how to be kind. Right before I reached him, Henry leaned close and said, "Your father would have liked him." I laughed through tears. "You know that for sure?" "He would have liked the steady jaw," Henry said. "And the fact that he looks nervous but isn't trying to hide it." I turned to him, shocked into a laugh. And then I walked forward and married the man who had stayed beside me when everything else collapsed. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Because karma, real karma, does not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it arrives like paperwork, subpoenas, witnesses, and the slow horror of realizing your lies have been documented better than your crimes. Mark's empire unraveled in stages. The company that had once carried my father's name was stripped of the fraudulent transfers and returned to the trust. Several employees came forward once they realized they could tell the truth without losing their jobs. The friend who had helped him create the shell companies cut a deal the moment investigators proved he had profited from the theft. The attorney who had notarized questionable filings was disbarred. The bank flagged years of suspicious activity that led to tax and fraud penalties large enough to bankrupt Mark's business entirely. At his first hearing, he showed up in an expensive suit and tried to project dignity. By the third, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. His face hardened when he saw me in the gallery. He actually tried to glare me down, as if I were still the child he could outmaneuver. But I was not a child anymore. I was the daughter of the man he had tried to erase, and I had the truth in my hands. At one point, he stood to address the court and insisted he had only done what was necessary to keep the family together. The judge looked at him with visible disgust. "Mr. Ellis," she said, "you forged property documents, misrepresented a will, and benefited from the death of a man whose estate you attempted to seize. Do not insult this court with sentiment." That sound, his public humiliation, should not have felt as satisfying as it did. But when he finally sat back down, defeated and sweating under the courtroom lights, I thought of all the times he had spoken to my mother in that same low, patient tone, as if his control had been a form of kindness. It wasn't. It was predation. The final blow came when the accident investigation uncovered enough evidence to support a wrongful death action against him, even though the criminal case remained complicated by time and lost records. He settled more to avoid complete destruction than out of remorse, but the money could not save him. His reputation was gone. His business was gone. His allies disappeared one by one when the public story turned. The man who had spent years walking around our family home like a king was eventually reduced to what he had always been beneath the charm: a coward. By then, my mother had moved into a small apartment near the church and started volunteering at a women's support center. Of all places, she called it her penance job the first time she told me about it, with a sad little smile. "I spent too many years afraid to speak," she said. "Maybe I can help other women speak sooner." I didn't forgive her overnight. I don't think there should ever be an overnight version of forgiveness when the damage took years to build. But slowly, carefully, I watched her try. She stopped making excuses. She attended every hearing. She apologized to Henry without asking for comfort. She sat with my father's framed photograph at Christmas and cried in a way that felt less like performance and more like a soul finally waking up. Henry bought back the old lake house from the trust and restored it piece by piece, not to relive the past, but to preserve it. In the upstairs study, he hung my father's toolbox above the desk and placed the original will in a fireproof case beside it. One afternoon, months after everything settled, I found Henry standing in the workshop with a wrench in his hand, staring at the wall. "He'd be proud of you," I said. Henry didn't turn around. "I know," I laughed softly. "That was very unhumble. At my age, I don't have time for false modesty." I moved beside him and looked at the workbench, where my father's old coffee mug now sat beside a stack of restoration notes. "I keep thinking about how long this was all hidden," I said. Henry nodded. "That's what people like Mark rely on. They count on time. They count on silence." I rested my hands on the bench. And what do they count on when both fail? Henry finally looked at me, and there was something almost peaceful in his expression. Then they count on their own panic, he said. I smiled. He was right. By the time the final civil judgments were issued, I had taken over the trust that held the remaining family assets. I did not return the old company name out of revenge. I changed it back because it belonged to my father, and because some things should be restored, not repackaged. We rehired a few of the original mechanics. We set up scholarships for kids entering trade school. We donated part of the recovered settlement to a legal aid fund for families targeted by financial abuse. That last part mattered to me more than the headlines ever would. Because if there was one thing I learned from all of this, it was that betrayal does not always look like yelling. Sometimes it wears a pressed shirt and carries your mother's groceries. Sometimes it smiles at family dinners. Sometimes it tells you it's helping while it quietly signs your life away. And justice, when it finally comes, rarely arrives in the dramatic way people expect. Sometimes justice is a dusty envelope in an old attorney's cabinet. Sometimes it is a brother who stayed alive long enough to bring the truth home. Sometimes it is a bride in a ruined wedding dress, watching the man who stole her family run for the door. And sometimes, if you are lucky, justice feels like standing in the place where your father once stood, looking out at the people who tried to bury him, and knowing they failed. On the first anniversary of our wedding, Daniel and I returned to the lake house for dinner. My mother came too. So did Henry. We ate on the porch while the sun dropped low over the water and turned the whole lake gold. At one point, Henry raised his glass and said, "To Richard Bennett." We all lifted ours. "To Richard," my mother whispered, tears in her eyes. I looked at the water and imagined my father there somehow, not in a haunting way, but in the quiet dignity of a man whose name had been nearly stolen and then returned to where it belonged. I thought about the last note he'd left me. Fight for what's yours. I had. And I won something bigger than property. I won the truth. I won my family back. Imperfectly and painfully, but back. I won the right to say my father's name without shame. And Mark Ellis? He learned too late that the people you lie to are not always the people who stay silent forever. He lost the house, the business, the respectability, the control, and the mask he had worn so well. He lost everything he had taken, and when he did, there was no one left to rescue him. Not my mother, not his friends, not the legal tricks he had relied on, not even the fear he had spent years planting in us. Because fear can keep a family quiet for a long time. But truth, once it walks through the door, has a way of turning even the loudest liar into a man looking for the nearest exit. And I will never forget the look on my stepfather's face when my Uncle Henry returned from the dead and brought my father's original will with him. That look was not surprise. It was the face of a man finally meeting the consequences he had spent years trying to outrun.